Over the last couple of years, Nintendo has been adding more and more games to their Switch online service for their legacy consoles. And whenever they put out a new system for it, they also put out a controller that you can buy that's compatible with the Switch to give you that nostalgic feel, like the Nintendo 64 controller. The only unfortunate part is they're still not easy to get, and whenever they go in stock on Nintendo's website, they're gone in generally less than 30 minutes. And if you look on places like eBay, a single controller goes for twice the suggested retail price, typically around $100 or more in the secondhand market. So obviously people are looking for alternatives that they can get to use on the Switch, and today we're going to check out one of those as it's recently released after going through an entire Kickstarter project, that being the Brawler 64 Bluetooth Nintendo Switch Online Edition. It's pretty obvious they were looking to solve that issue and provide a product that would at least slot in well enough. It comes in at $45, about $5 less than what the 64 controller is supposed to cost, and it still retains all of the same features in what I would say a better overall design when it comes to ergonomics, but we'll check that out here today. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure you like it and subscribe if you're new. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, they did send over 3 different Brawler 64 Bluetooth controllers for me to check out here on the channel, so let's start with an unboxing. Let's take a look around the box first. Retro Fighters, Brawler 64 wireless gamepad, Switch in big font up here. It is also PC compatible, so keep that in mind. Of course, this connects through Bluetooth, but it is specifically designed for Nintendo Switch Online with the N64 application. Obviously, just based on the controller itself, this one with the color scheme based around that N64 controller. All right, box open, and it looks like we have the controller and a USB Type-C to A cable for charging. Then we have a manual and a reminder to charge the controller for a minimum of 2 hours before using for the first time. Anyway, we have our controller here. If you've ever used a Retro Fighter controller, they already have one like this, but it's wired. This in particular was designed with the Switch in mind, yes, but the Bluetooth technology that would then sync up to it and be found as a Switch compatible device. It also has a swap button that apparently will go from the Nintendo 64 configuration to a Pro controller configuration. I mean, it still is set up to where it could, of course, be a Pro controller, as we do have our face buttons A, B, our C buttons here, start in the middle, a fairly large D-pad. We have minus and home, obviously because start would be our plus button. We have the single joystick over here that has some pretty good tension to it. Snaps right back to the center, has this nice rubberized texture on top. The back, unfortunately, does not have that same rubberized texture, and that's something I would like to see from Retro Fighters in the future with a controller like this, is just the bottom part here. Have this be some sort of texture that feels a bit more grippy in the hand. It doesn't feel like it's gonna fly out of your hand or anything like that, but just a nice little extra touch like that I think would be welcomed. On top, we do have our USB-C input for charging. It's sort of sunken into the controller. I guess that way it can grab the cable a bit more so it's less likely to break the charge port there. So that's a nice touch. We have our swap button, and then we have our screenshot button. We have some pretty large L and R buttons here, and yeah, we have two trigger buttons essentially, and they're both represented as Z. Obviously, for the N64, you only need a Z button, but if you want to switch this over into the Pro controller setup, you would need both ZR and ZL. And for the player indicator light, it's right here in a vertical orientation. We can see the blue light jumping up and down there. That way you can represent whoever is 1, 2, 3, or 4 players. And that's pretty much it. Why don't we try this out? I have a Switch right here. There's a sync button, I believe, right here on the back. A quick press of the sync button got it to show up here. It does have low battery, so I'm gonna switch over to the other Retro Fighter controller that they sent out that I've been charging for a little bit. This one's just all white, so they blank canvas, I guess, for that. I have been charging a little bit. It's also low battery though, so you definitely want to leave this thing plugged in as long as they say for about 2 hours, but we should have enough time to at least check everything out here. Let me hit the swap button though. I am curious if it will then show up as a Pro controller with that. It does. All right, so that's kind of a cool feature. If you want to have the Pro controller set up, you can do that here. Otherwise, just this button press on this guy here, and we'll see it kick over pretty quickly, actually, 5 seconds or so, and we'll then get the Nintendo 64 controller. So here's how this is set up. I mentioned we have 2 different trigger buttons here on the back. Both of them are marked as Z. The right one is indeed ZR, and I guess ZL then would be just Z normally. So if I press on the right here, even though they both say the Z, it kicks me into that suspend menu. So you still have access to that, even though it is just marked as Z. And the thing with the joystick itself, all right, so with the joystick on a controller like this, it feels a little weird at first. And the reason I say that is because there is a lot of travel with it. And if you consider the Nintendo 64 controller, that joystick has a lot of travel, and you can change it out for a GameCube controller, like that setup with that joystick. But the problem you run into is the travel is shorter, so it will do some weird things in a Nintendo 64 game, as opposed to having the standard or the classic joystick, I guess, with a ton of travel. And that's why I assume this joystick feels very, very tall, is the best way I can describe it. But the joystick feels significantly better than Nintendo 64 joystick, as you'd expect, right? I mean, we're talking about the difference of more than 2 decades, right? Like 25 years or something when it comes to the technology around that. I've also noticed that the Z buttons are pretty aggressive coming out of the plastic here. They essentially jut completely outwards to where they almost line up with L and R. And I guess in a way that it's good for being able to rest your fingers on them. But I think because these aren't analog triggers or anything and they don't have a ton of travel, they probably could have gotten away with it being maybe a bit more angled down. It feels very strange when you're first using it. Although I guess I could get used to it as a good spot to kind of rest my fingers. It's something you'll notice right away. There is also rumble. I can feel it right now as Yoshi's sort of jumping and trying to float through the air here. It's definitely the older style rumble. However, it's not an issue since the Nintendo 64 really wouldn't do much with the advanced haptic feedback. It was designed at a time where rumble just being in a controller was a big deal. So trying to do HD rumble isn't really that necessary here. I do like the C buttons being right next to the A button. This almost comes off as a 6-button controller, doesn't it? Just sort of the setup for it. It's a lot easier to jump from A to C down or C right or anything on this side. And then from B, it's pretty easy to jump all the way up to C up. And the buttons are a bit bigger and they have a bit more travel to them as well. So it does have, I'd say, just a nicer press overall, which would make playing games like Mortal Kombat or Tony Hawk much easier. So Nintendo should probably think about adding those soon. The D-pad is fine as well. I'm not like blown away by it. It is kind of a mushier press. I do like that it's a larger D-pad that's, again, very easy to get to. It doesn't have an obvious pivot point to it, but it also doesn't seem like it's easy to hit 2 different buttons at the same time necessarily. So you're not gonna go around just accidentally hitting up when you're trying to hit right or anything like that. And it does roll pretty well. So, all those fighters that Nintendo has on here should do great. Also, a quick check to see if it turns on the Switch, press the home button and turns it right on. We'll go ahead and take a quick look inside the Retro Fighter controller while we're here. There's only about, 7 Phillips head screws on the back. Screws out, the back comes off here, and we can immediately see our battery and 2 rumble motors, which it is good that they didn't try to just go with one, whether it's in just one of the handles or even right in the middle. This way you will have pretty good rumble in both handles, and it was very noticeable when I was playing something like Yoshi's Story. The battery here, it is detachable. It's a 550 milliamp hour battery. They could probably go a little bit larger. I mean, there's plenty of room back here, obviously. I think they quote 10 hours or so of gameplay on a full charge. So maybe something to think about in the future, getting a little bit of a larger battery in there, get closer to 20 hours, for example. I do like that the shoulder buttons have their own rubber membrane kind of that's attached to it for the button press. That way it'll feel, I guess you'd say, more spongy. And that is essentially how the Nintendo 64 button feels when you press it down, so there is some attention to detail here. They kind of did something similar here with the other buttons that are off on their own, essentially like A and B, kind of off on their own compared to the C buttons that can all have one large rubber membrane here, and that way they can kind of place these where they need to. I do like that the D-pad is just off on its own board right here, so it's not just kind of shoehorned into this one at all. We can see the D-pad has it does have that nice pivot in the middle there. It's not a huge spike or anything going past the directions, but it's good enough. It's definitely serviceable in that regard. And we do have a board, and this goes for a lot of Retro Fighters stuff that they've put out. These boards are thick. These are not thin, flimsy boards that they're using for these controllers. The joystick appears to be a very similar stick that we've seen in all the other controllers, Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo. They do quote 30 feet for the Bluetooth connection, and we have our antenna over here in a pretty interesting spot. I don't really think you're gonna be covering it up much necessarily, or gripping it, or really causing any interference, so it's not too bad of a positioning for it. Their plastic is also pretty rigid as well, so it doesn't bend or flex very much. And it all kind of works together to create a controller that does have a higher quality feel, but I think they just need one more thing, and a lot of that just comes down to the backing here on the outside. Again, just some sort of gripping material, rubberized or different texture on the back, I think would just put it up over the edge. I also just jumped around between a couple of 64 games I was very familiar with to test it out and see how the feel was. And for the most part, the only thing I had to get used to is which Z button worked in game and which one took me to the suspend menu. It was a bit easier because it was the left Z button, which is typically what I'd be pressing with my left hand for the Z button under a normal Nintendo 64 controller. And I did like the control stick. It definitely has more tension than Nintendo 64's stock controller, but after getting used to it, I think it worked well. And I do like the positioning and the feel of the C buttons on this controller, as it does get closer to what I would say a 6-button controller. I know the Nintendo 64 controller tries to kind of do that at times, but the C buttons are just in a very weird place, and it's definitely not something that's easy to reach in the middle of a game. So I do like what they've done here with this Brawler 64 controller. They already had one before, but that was like a wired Brawler 64 controller that just happened to work with the Switch, and it wasn't set up like this one, where they certainly went all out trying to make it the Nintendo Switch Online N64 controller that also has functionality as a Switch Pro controller. The only issue there is you just have one analog stick with this. You don't have the dual analog setup, so for some games, probably not going to work well, if at all. But I guess it being able to function as a Switch Pro controller means it could work with the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, or Sega Genesis games, which with the D-pad and the button layout, I mean, part of it almost looks like a 6-button controller for the Genesis, probably wouldn't be too bad to use for it. I do like the controller. I think it's priced pretty well at $45, and from what I saw internally on the controller, it is at least built with some quality in mind. And it's also in stock. So in terms of that versus the Nintendo 64 controller that Nintendo posts on their website, that's a pretty big advantage. At least if you're looking to even have multiple controllers on hand, this might even be a good one to have for third or fourth player. But let me know what you guys think about the Brawler 64 Bluetooth controller for NSO. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.